Hey everyone, back with another weekly news update. This one's going to run from the 28th of April to the 4th of May, so we'll close out April and get started with May, and I'll keep doing this every week. It'll be long format, but I think it's the right balance of detail and timeliness. So let's get into it and talk about what went on this past week in Ukraine. So we're starting in Kyiv on the 28th. We saw a farmer found a cluster munition. Now, based on what I know about the cluster munitions that are used in Ukraine, this is a Russian cluster munition and it's delivered by MRL. So either from an Uragan or a Smerch system. And it's either a 9N210 or a 9N235, but I'm not sure which one it is. I couldn't tell you that. I'm not an EOD expert, but I know it's one of those two. Okay, so that was interesting because it's probably left over from 2022. So it just shows the extent to which even Kyiv still has a lot of UXO and demining and EOD work that needs to be done after the full scale invasion in 2022. So Chernihiv, let's talk about Chernihiv a little bit. So we saw in Semenivka airstrikes, but also FPV strikes. A 68-year-old woman was killed, and a 38-year-old was wounded. In Kostobobriv, a 61-year-old was also wounded. So we have drone strikes all across the border. How we're going to map this border is going to change later, as you guys will see towards the end of this video. It'll be much more full here because I was relying on the general staff for a while, but the general staff and the ODA are not reliable enough to get a clearer picture, so we needed to dig into some other sources to clear that up. So that'll be forthcoming. Taking a look at Sumy. Again, I had discussed last week that Sumy is changing how they're reporting the shelling and civilian casualties, which makes our job a lot more difficult. They're not really reporting what weapons platforms are being used to hit where. They're just kind of saying, in that rayon, this happened. And it doesn't really tell us very much. It's just like, okay, so I know that there were some buildings destroyed, and maybe I might know if a person was killed or wounded, but I think they're going to improve that over time. So civilian casualties in Sumy on the 28th, we saw one person killed in Shalahina. Again, that's a hot spot that we were talking about for the past month. And also in Krasnopilya, we saw a man was wounded, and he and his dog were evacuated. Yeah, this guy was wounded in shelling, and that's his doggo. So White Angels got them out of there. But that was our civilian casualties in Sumy Oblast for the 28th. Taking a look at Kharkiv. In Kharkiv, we saw in Bohudukiv, there was a grenade fight, I think, or a random explosion of some kind that ended up killing one man. And then also we had some arson where 3 teen boys, excuse me, 15 and 16 years old, 2 brothers, and then their 14-year-old friend set fire to some railway infrastructure and also set fire to a car as well in Bohudukiv. In addition to that, we also saw Shaheds hitting in Makro which ended up killing 30 cows. They ended up hitting a farm and killing 30 cows. In Kupiansk, on the other side, we saw 2 people wounded by artillery and airstrikes. As you can see, high saturation of artillery, airstrikes, and MRL reported throughout Kupiansk. And in addition to that, we saw one of those bulldozers, actually, that we had taken a look at on the map before, unfortunately is no longer demining. Let's see if we can find it here. Yeah, this isn't the best picture, but there were quite a few of them that they showed. One of the Komatsu bulldozers donated by Japan. There we go. That's the picture. Ended up hitting a landmine, and well, I mean that's what it's supposed to do. But it sustained some pretty significant damage, so it's out of action for the foreseeable future until it can get repaired. And in addition to that, we also saw UXO casualties. There were 2 people killed and 1 person wounded when they tried to dismantle an artillery shell in Mala Komishuvaka in southern Kharkiv. Okay, moving into Cherkasy, into the center of the country, there were Shahed strikes that knocked out gas power throughout. There were actually there was geolocated smoke and fire near the airport there, which took out some natural gas infrastructure and kind of like shut off natural gas for all those people in that area. In addition to that, let's go to Donetsk. Let me see if I can find a civilian casualty. Yep, okay. Our civilian casualty report for Donetsk Oblast. In Novoekonomichne, there were 3 people killed. In Shakhova, there was 1 person killed and 3 wounded. In Konstantinivka, there was 1 person killed. And in Ivanopilia, there was 1 person wounded. Now, in terms of the platforms there, we also saw Novoekonomichne, the people who were wounded there, that was artillery shelling as far as we were, or killed there. We think that was artillery shelling. In Shakhova, it was a combination of airstrikes and drone strikes, like FPV or Mavic, mostly FPV. In Konstantinivka, there was an airstrike that killed a person there, and then in Ivanopilia, it was also an airstrike that wounded a person there. In addition to that, we also saw up in Liman and Zarichne in northern Donetsk Oblast, there was 1 person who was wounded by artillery shelling in Zarichne, and then also there were 2 people wounded in Liman, 1 by a FPV and 1 by MRL shelling. So we saw them evacuated from there. Okay. Also, just this little marker here is kind of interesting. There's still 871 people in Rodinska, just north of Pokrovsk here. You can see it's not that far from the front line. Like, let's see. From the Russian line, we're talking less than 20 kilometers. That's not fun. That's scary, especially knowing the range of Russian artillery. So you still have almost 1,000 people living there, and they don't have electricity, gas, water. They're really just, and they haven't had it since September. So they're constantly being shelled, but still persevering through it. Okay. In Dnipro, Dnipropetrovsk, but actually in Dnipro itself, we saw that there was a terrorist plot in Dnipro that was disrupted. There were, I believe it was a couple that was 23 or 28 and 36 years old. They had planted a bomb near a railway fuel tank and were trying to detonate it, but that was disrupted. So those markers all have to deal with that. It was just different sources reporting it. In addition to that, we saw in Kryvyi Rih, a little baby deer got saved. It got hit by a car. The roe deer got saved. Now, it says thanks to the police and a veterinarian, it survived. If you follow the Instagram account Wildlife UA, I believe is what it's called, it did not. The deer died, unfortunately. They report on rescued animals throughout Ukraine, and I'm pretty sure it was the same roe deer that they posted about. Unfortunately, yeah, the deer did not survive. Sad. Okay. Nikopol. We saw a 59-year-old man killed in Nikopol from an FPV drone strike as well. Okay, talking about Kherson, in Kherson Oblast on the 28th, pretty active. We saw, first off, some good news. 4 children were returned from occupied territory. One of them was a 17-year-old boy who had actually been forcibly conscripted by the Russian forces, and managed to escape somehow to Ukrainian territory, and now he's luckily safe from having to be, put into one of those DNR, LNR, or a volunteer battalion, Storm Z battalion, or something like that. It would be pretty horrific. So it's really good that he was able to escape. The kids ranged in age from 10 to 17 years old. Sorry. All right, casualties, civilian casualties. We saw 7 people wounded on the 28th itself, but 3 people who were wounded prior were also wounded and reported to the hospital for medical attention. In Kherson, 3 people were wounded on April 22nd by artillery shelling, and that is those 3 people who were injured prior. Other casualties were in Komishani. If we go to the west of the city, Komishani, there were 3 people injured by artillery shelling on that day, as well as Bilazerka. There were 2 people wounded by artillery shelling and 1 person wounded in a drone attack. And in Kherson itself, 1 person was wounded in a drone attack. And we also saw airstrikes in Kherson almost every day this week, but at least every day this week in Kherson Oblast. But for 3 or 4 days in a row, there were airstrikes in Kherson. So a really active week in Kherson in regards to aerial bombing activity, which is, it's not always typical, but it's definitely picked up in the last month especially, but really since December, I would say it's certainly picked up in the last 6 months. Okay. Beyond that, in Mykolaiv, there was a pretty tragic incident in Voznesensk where a 21-year-old police officer was killed when a man that they were chasing, he and a group of other police officers were chasing a man to detain him. The man threw a grenade at them, and the police officer, Sergeant Maxim Rizhko, died in the line of duty. And in Odessa, there was also a Shahed strike in Izmail, all the way in the southernmost region here. That southernmost region of Odessa. Okay. That's the 28th. All right, the 29th. Let's start in Lviv. So, in Lviv, we saw there were 2 teen boys who were arrested for arson of railway infrastructure. That's not the one. Here we go. So you can see here, any sort of switch boxes along railways, they try and burn those out, or signal power infrastructure for the signals on train tracks are all being targeted, as well as other infrastructure. Okay, let's go to Kyiv. In Kyiv, we saw Shahed strikes, wounding 3 people across the city. In Sumy, we saw civilian casualties in Esmanska. Again, we're not really sure which village this happened in because it wasn't necessarily reported by the Sumy ODA that clearly, and general staff didn't really report any shelling on this day in this area. So in the future, we're going to be supplementing this area with OK Pivnich, Operational Command North, and get them involved. So we do know in Esmon, there was one person killed and one wounded. It was a father and a son. They were moving. They were actually beekeepers, apiculturists, moving their apiaries into a van. Yeah, we have a picture of the van here, so you can see they were moving the bee habitats. But I believe the son was killed, and the father was injured. So a tragic incident there in northern Sumy Oblast. We also saw in Nova Sloboda over here there was a double tap strike on firefighters, and there was also a drone attack on a evacuation in Krasnopilya. So we saw this evacuation here was carried out under some duress. Okay, taking a look at Donetsk Oblast. Oh wait, sorry, Kharkiv Oblast. Can't skip that. Um, oh, and in Krasnopilya, we did see one police officer was wounded um, during an evacuation on the 29th. Forgot to mention that. Kharkiv, civilian casualties. First off, in Kindrashivka, up here. Kindrashivka, we had one person wounded by shelling. Next door in Tishankivka, there was one person wounded as well. In Mali Prohody, which is up here, in Mali Prohody, 2 people were wounded by a drone attack. And back over near Kupiansk in Osinove, yep, there was an airstrike which wounded one person. Now, the main event in Kharkiv, obviously, on the 29th were the massive wave of Shahed strikes, which across Kharkiv wounded 45 people in total. 2 of those were children, and another one of the casualties was a pregnant woman who was injured. And then also, just outside of Kharkiv itself, in Derhachi, there were 2 people who were also wounded by Shahed strikes across the oblast. But as you can see, there were also Shahed strikes in Chernihiv, just outside the city over here, and then also in southern Kharkiv Oblast as well. Okay, now to Donetsk Oblast. Our civilian casualty report. In Shachova, there was 1 person killed and 1 person wounded. That was from a combination of airstrikes and artillery. In Pokrovsk, 2 people were wounded, again from a combination of airstrikes and artillery. In Rodinska, just north of, like we had talked about, just north of Pokrovsk, 2 people were wounded from artillery shelling there. And then in Dronivka, 1 person was wounded from artillery shelling there. One other note about what's going on in Donetsk Oblast in regards to civilian casualties are reports coming out of Pokrovsk, and I won't show images. You can click on them and take a look yourself, just because it's not good for YouTube. There's a lot of sort of makeshift civilian graves that are popping up in the former green spaces and yards throughout the city of civilians that have just been murdered by Russian bombing and artillery shelling and MRL strikes. So we don't have a super clear idea as to how many people have been killed or wounded in Pokrovsk. Like, obviously, the casualty reports are much lower than the reality because they're discovering these makeshift graves and talking to neighbors and trying to figure out the circumstances under which people were killed. So there's a lot of verification that has to be done, and venturing into some pretty dangerous areas where obviously, like, drones have the ability to pretty much fly completely over Pokrovsk at this point, and they do control some of the roads. Like, I've heard reports of, like, the road to Novoekonomichne is pretty dangerous. Obviously, that would mean like this area is probably pretty dangerous as well between Radinska and Pokrovsk. So keep in mind, like FPVs are definitely taking their toll here, even though we don't have markers as well. So Pokrovsk is kind of hellish right now. Not kind of hellish, it is hellish right now. Okay, we need to take a look at Zaporizhzhia. In Zaporizhzhia, it wasn't clear as to where the civilian casualty was incurred, but a 68-year-old woman was wounded in an attack. And then in Primorska, there was a 45-year-old man injured when his vehicle was struck by an FPV. So a human safari style attack on vehicles, which we definitely see on this road between Kamyanska and Zaporizhzhia. There's been reports of FPV drone attacks all along that road there. Okay. In Dnipro, let's take a look, or Dnipropetrovsk, let's take a look at Nikopol. In Nikopol, there were 4 people wounded in FPV drone attacks across the city. There was also artillery shelling, which kind of accompanies the FPV drones at the same time. Elsewhere in Dnipropetrovsk, we saw Shahed strikes. This was geolocated to this area, I believe, off of a public geolocation. We saw Shahed strikes, which killed one person, I believe a 53-year-old man, and wounded another individual. In addition to that, in Velika Mykolaiv, yep, we saw airstrikes on that city, which wounded 5 people total. So some pretty horrific strikes there, pretty close to the Russian forces advancing out of Donetsk into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Also, north of, you can see Shaheds made it north of Dnipro into Hubinka. In Hubinka, or Hubinka, okay. Need to get that right. Hubinka. There was a really tragic incident where a family was hit by a Shahed drone. A 12-year-old girl was killed, and her 6-year-old sister was wounded, as well as the parents who were wounded. Pretty horrific. Okay, one thing that is important that happened in Dnipro is the SBU detained the leadership of a defense plant in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast for supplying defective mortar shells to the armed forces of Ukraine. The general director and his first deputy, a former head of the military representation of the Ministry of Defense, and the head of the control group were arrested. 120,000 unusable 120mm mortar rounds were supplied due to the use of low-quality materials and defective workmanship. The officials involved faced 15 years in prison. So that's pretty important, and we've talked about, or at least Andrew's talked about on this channel before, about the importance of mortars and about how there were defective mortars that are hampering Ukrainian operations. So interesting to see that someone's finally being held accountable for that. So perhaps that issue will be rectified. 120,000 is a pretty significant amount of munitions. Okay. Beyond that, we need to move on to Kherson. So Kherson, let's take a look at our casualty report for the day. On the 29th in Kherson, in Shiroka Balka, there emerged 2 reports of wounded elderly women, both in their 80s, wounded in artillery shelling on 13th April. So Shiroka Balka, that's down here near Stanislav, near the tip of Kherson Oblast. In Dniprovsky Raion, inside Kherson, there were airstrikes. We saw 3 people wounded initially, and then 1 person wounded by a drone. And also in Stanislav, we saw 1 person wounded in a drone strike reportedly on that day, according to national police. And we also saw in Bilazerka 2 people wounded in shelling, and then in Korabelny in central Kherson, there were 2 other people wounded in shelling. Okay. In Mykolaiv, we saw in Kutsurubska, Kutsurub is right here, Kutsurubska Hromada kind of takes up this coastal area here. We saw there were 2 people injured in artillery shelling in Dnipropetrovsk. All right, on to the 30th. So let's start in Zhytomyr. So in Zhytomyr, we saw that there were there was a 22-year-old young mother who was from Korostan in Zhytomyr Oblast. She was detained by the SBU for essentially taking her child on walks throughout the city and other military, like close to military locations, and like taking her kid for a walk, but all the while she was photographing and sending geolocating coordinates of these military installations and other targets, critical infrastructure, for example. So for missile and drone strikes. So using your kid to commit espionage and terrorism is pretty objectionable. We also saw in Kyiv there was a Russian citizen who murdered his 21-year-old girlfriend. So a Russian citizen in Kyiv killing people, you know, hundreds of kilometers behind the line, still killing Ukrainians. In Chernihiv, some illegal arms that we saw here. An AK-74U and, you know, a good amount of weapons. We also saw a Shahed drone kind of, I don't know, disassemble itself, and they detonated the warhead. We also saw a grenade explosion. I'm not going to show the picture because I don't think I can here, even though it's blurred out mostly. In Horodina, Horodnya, we saw a grenade explosion in a store, which I believe killed 1 person and wounded 2 others, if I'm not mistaken. So a lot of grenade explosions this week, to be honest. We also saw airstrikes in Semenivka as well, and evacuation of civilians in Semenivka. An 86-year-old woman. Again, keep in mind, most evacuations that are happening are with people who have limited mobility and couldn't leave in the first place. That's really common. Okay, in Sumy, civilian casualties. We saw in Esman, 1 person killed, 1 wounded. We saw evacuations in Unikivka. And you can see it was under the threat of drones the entire time. So they had an officer with a shotgun on drone duty while they got the old man into the van. But he had been living in a barn that had been burnt out, like a burned out barn, completely burned out, and living without electricity or water or anything. So, and Russian forces obviously have kept up the pressure, trying to keep up their incursion here and trying to close out what piece of Kursk that Ukraine still holds. So this area is catching quite a bit of flack, even though we don't have reports like we used to from the Sumy ODA. You could assume that there's probably shelling going on here. It's just we're not getting it from the general staff, so then we're not getting it, and we're not getting it from the Sumy ODA once they changed their format. They're doing a much more restricted informational format for us, which is unfortunate, but it's perhaps necessary. One other thing I wanted to bring people's attention to, we had talked about these munitions being dropped from drones or being put into drones a couple weeks ago, earlier last month. But, okay, this is a Molnia, so you can see a Molnia drone, how it has an anti-tank mine as a warhead there after it kind of disassembled itself. Again, Russian drones tend to do that. Oh, yeah. And this is kind of humorous, right? So, like, why 3D print the tail if you're just going to use a quadcopter to guide the VOG into the target? Doesn't make a ton of sense. So, it brings up the question. Now, it might not necessarily be true, but like, makes me question as to whether the Russians have n- not enough munitions for FPVs in this direction, or do they not have, or do they not have Mavics to deliver the munitions here? So they just are using them with FPVs. I don't know. I don't know. It's interesting, if not a little embarrassing. But with the cluster munitions, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay. Kharkiv. We need to talk about drone attacks on Pivdene. In Pivdene, there was a pretty significant amount of Shahed drone strikes all on the city, which caused 14 casualties across the city, 9 of which were children. Um, and we also saw a Molnia drone strikes on Kharkiv itself, although those didn't cause any casualties as far as I'm aware. We also saw a 17-year-old in Kharkiv committing arson. Yep, he burned down some military vehicles and accidentally burned down some more. And in Kupiansk, we saw shelling in Osinove and Novo Osinove. Osinove. And there were 2 people wounded in Osinove and 1 person killed in Novo Osinove. And also, in Mykolaiv, another 2 people wounded in an FPV drone strike. Okay, in Donetsk Oblast. Here we are. If we can get there. Yes, we're here. There was 1 person wounded in Dnipropetrovsk. Obviously, there were more potentially, but according to official reports, only 1 wounded in Dnipropetrovsk on the 30th. In terms of evacuations, we're seeing people evacuating throughout Donetsk Oblast. You can click on these and just see there's more and more and more civilian evacuation statistics if you're interested. But mostly we're seeing people were being evacuated to Dnipro and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, other cities within there, but now they're actually being evacuated to Khmelnytsky, Ivano-Frankivsk, Lviv, Chernihiv, Zakarpattia. So we're starting to see people settling much further west as internally displaced persons than we have before. Because a lot of people that were living in Donetsk Oblast ended up resettling in Dnipropetrovsk, kind of close to the front line, more or less. And now they're having to evacuate for a second time in some cases. But also, people in Donetsk Oblast just moved back further to other places in Donetsk, like moved from Pokrovsk to Dobropilya, kind of thing. So people are evacuating and then evacuating and evacuating. So let's talk now about Dnipro itself. We saw Shahed strikes on Dnipro. Again, 1 person killed, 1 wounded. And we saw an 88-year-old woman in Kamyanska die from her wounds sustained in the drone attack on 26th April. Unfortunately, as well as FPV drone strikes in Nikopol, which wounded 1 person. Okay. In Zaporizhzhia, kind of backtracking here, I know because Dnipro Dnipropetrovsk kind of goes from Donetsk over in between these two, so we do have to jump kind of around a little bit sometimes. In Zaporizhzhia, we saw a delivery of some German aid. There were generators delivered to Zaporizhzhia with a capacity of 50 kilowatts and 99 kilowatts, respectively, which is important, as well as Shahed strikes on Zaporizhzhia itself. We also saw in Kherson no reports of civilian casualties specifically on that day from either the ODA or the Kherson police, but we did still see plenty of attacks. So the Kherson police essentially just reported on the 30th that there were a bunch of people wounded on the 29th. All right, May 1st. Starting in Kyiv, we saw Shaheds that were scattering cluster munitions and causing forest fires. So we saw reports of fires across Kyiv. Let me get you a better view here. Forest fires across Kyiv from falling debris. Shahed strikes all around. And then we saw here that there were reports in Donetsk of sappers working to neutralize unexploded ordnance, some of which might be scattered by Russian UAVs, right? So there were 10 explosions heard in Donetsk in the forest park zone, which ignited some of these fires. That the explosions kind of damaged some of the buildings, and they were scattered through UAVs, potentially in their wings or dropped like bombs. I've seen evidence potentially that they're stored in the wings, but I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, it's not in this. It's not on this day in Sumy, but one of these days in Sumy, there were actual cluster munitions stored in the wings of a UAV platform, which was pretty interesting to see for the first time. Okay, in Chernihiv, kind of an interesting thing here. A guy got caught with a DP-27, which is pretty interesting because that's an, if you know anything about firearms, that's a really, really old firearm. That is almost 100 years old. It's one of the first light machine guns ever manufactured, ever. So really interesting to see that kind of like historical artifact just thrown in amongst the laundry, as you do. But Chernihiv Oblast never keeps disappointing with the interesting machine guns that they find there. Because keep in mind, Chernihiv Oblast was also where we found the guy with the dismounted coax PKT machine gun that you rip off a T-72. So, thank you, Chernihiv Oblast. Also, we saw a airstrike on Rohivka. This area is getting a lot of attention from aerial strikes, interestingly, as reported by the General Staff. In Sumy Oblast, we saw civilian casualties in Mykolaiv Hromada and Myropilska Hromada. And let's move to Kharkiv. In Kharkiv, we saw Molnia strikes across the city, but that didn't result in any civilian casualties. Again, Molnia, your payload is very much limited compared to a Shahed, and they're a bit slower, and as a result, not as effective. But they do have pretty decent range for being such kind of a crappy platform, generally speaking. Okay, some other things that we saw in Kharkiv city itself. We saw a employee of Ukrzaliznytsia, the national railroad company, uh, working as a agent for Russian forces and giving them targeting information, the paths of helicopters, other airbase locations, anything that he could kind of give in terms of logistical information. He passed that on to Russian special services. He was caught and detained and charged. Also, we saw Shahed strikes in the very south of Kharkiv Oblast in Bliznyuki, wounding one person. In Vilkovatka, we saw one person wounded in a airstrike. We also saw Shahed strikes on Balaklia and on Vasyshcheve. So, those strikes did not result in civilian casualties, but just noteworthy. Over here in Novi Burluk, we did have information about a Russian war crime from 2022 being committed. I believe, yeah, this guy stole. He beat up a resident of the village and then stole his car and his trailer. Detained the guy, threatened him. So, psychological and physical torture, as well as robbery, just straight up robbery. Okay, Donetsk Oblast. Activity was mostly centered in and around Pokrovsk here. In Nova Ekonomichna, we had one person killed and one person wounded by artillery shelling. In Mirnohrad, there was one person killed by an airstrike, and in Dorozhnya, there was one person wounded by an FPV drone strike. And I wanted to show you guys this. Yeah. There's an old pug. But she had two dogs. But this dog was this guy, he's an old man, this dog. But yeah, his skin folds are so foldy that it's like covering his eye completely. But yeah, no, it was nice to see the doggos get out safe. Okay. In Zaporizhzhia, we got this kind of like spurt of activity going on with airstrikes just north of Hulaypula, which is kind of out of the norm. Don't really see that often. So, something to keep an eye on. Could just be a one-off, but might signal more preparations for a push towards Hulaypula from the Russians. But they seem, I have to say, they seem really focused more in the Kamyanska area, and they did have some initial successes, right? We do see a day before this, on the 30th, they recaptured this area. There were some like contested ground here. If we go back, you can see there was some contested ground from a Russian thrust into Malay Takhmachka near Chernihiv, but that was eliminated and recaptured as far as we can tell. Okay. Zaporizhzhia, the big event, was not the airstrikes north of Hulaypula, however. It was this concentration of Shahed strikes. There was one Shahed strike on an apartment building in Zaporizhzhia. In total, 31 people were wounded. There was a report of one person killed, but that ended up being, I guess that was not a false report, but it wasn't necessarily correct because the person was revived, thankfully, which is, you don't really get that in a report very often. Usually, you get reports where like it says people could not be revived. So to see that someone was actually successfully revived, and I think 3 people were rescued from the rubble. So there were people trapped under rubble after the Shahed strikes. Really good to see that nobody died, but unfortunately there were a lot of civilian casualties, 31 in total. Okay, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. We need to talk about strikes in Slavyanka. So we saw in Slavyanka 2 people were wounded by drone strikes. Now keep in mind this is not very far from where Russian forces are advancing in Donetsk Oblast near Pokrovsk, right? It's just up the road from Pokrovsk, Slavyanka, right? Kind of the same distance as like Dobropilya is to Pokrovsk. You have Slavyanka within a similar distance. Okay. Slavyanka, 2 wounded from drones. In Pokrovska, closer to Nikopol, Pokrovska, right? So we have Pokrov. Pokrovska Hromada is the general area around it. Or, well, it's this area here. Including Kapelivka, Oleksievka, Pokrovske. Not Pokrovska, Pokrovske. Pokrovske. There was 1 person wounded, and then there was another drone strike in which 30 livestock were wounded when a farm was hit. Also, Shahed strikes near Zelenodolsk, near the power plant. Okay, Kherson Oblast. In Kherson, on the 1st of May, there were 11 total wounded. We had 1 person wounded in a drone strike in Mykolaiv, or not Mykolaiv, Mykilska, is more accurate pronunciation. Sorry. In Antonivka, 3 people wounded. In Satralny, 2 people wounded from drone attacks and 2 people wounded from shelling. To the north, we saw UXO kind of having quite the day here, which was unexpected that it all kind of came at once. But in Davidov Brid, and we know Davidov Brid, that was one area in the counteroffensive which recaptured Kherson, where that was one of the major crossing points for Ukrainian forces and one of the major defensive hard points for Russian forces. So we saw like heavy mining throughout this area, and there's a lot of EOD work that needs to be done here. Unfortunately, 2 of the EOD workers were wounded when I think they didn't suffer like horrific injuries from my understanding. It was like a lot of like concussion, some abrasions, and then one of them I think broke a finger. So like not complete, like we're not talking amputations from what I understand. So fortunately, like I think they'll return back to doing EOD work. But yeah, 2 EOD workers from Odessa were wounded. Unfortunately, a farmer, a 47-year-old farmer in Andriivka here, was wounded when he stepped on a mine. Okay. Those are our UXO casualties for the day. In Kherson, we saw again FPV drone strikes in Kutsurubska, Hromada, and then we saw in Odessa Shahed drone strikes, which in Odessa there were 2 people killed and 15 wounded from the Shahed strikes, and we had a public geolocation which gave us this as the general area of the area struck, the building struck. Okay. All right, let's talk about May 2nd. On May 2nd, we saw a incident in which there was a false bomb threat called in by a 49-year-old woman in Zaporizhzhia Oblast. And we also saw a false bomb threat in Kyiv. He called it into a school, a 41-year-old man. So both of them were arrested. Interesting, 2 bomb threats on the same day. Maybe part of a coordinated plan. perhaps just coincidence, but nonetheless interesting. One other thing, you might see all these skull and crossbones and be like, what the heck happened in Kyiv on this day? Well, what happened in Kyiv is they detained a serial killer. He was a guy from Uzbekistan who was wanted for killing 11 people over 6 years, mostly within Kyiv, but I guess one also in Kharkiv. I think he killed one person in Kharkiv or two people in Kharkiv. But yeah, pretty wild story. So that's what's going on there. I felt it was worth mapping because, serial killers are fairly newsworthy events, and it seems like he was targeting homeless people specifically, which was very interesting and scary and sad all at the same time. Okay, one other thing that we had go on in Kyiv Oblast, and this isn't a good thing, there was a 12-year-old boy who found 2 hand grenades, and he unscrewed the fuse from one of it, and it detonated in his hand. So he was injured and hospitalized, and his father has been charged for illegal arms possession. Okay, Chernihiv. So, Chernihiv, we have all this geolocated footage, and we got one airstrike, but what happened to all of those drone strikes like we used to see, right? Let's go back a couple weeks, and we'll see lots more. Yeah, there was a good day there. You have to go much further back into April to start seeing something much more consistent. Yeah. So, the reason that is the general staff has gotten very quiet about what's going on in Chernihiv. They're not really giving us very many reports, maybe 1 or 2 towns a day in terms of what's getting hit. We know for sure that it's way more than that. It's way more than that. So I'm going to be introducing Pivnich, Operational Command North, right, to give us a much better picture for the 3rd and the 4th. So that's why everything up to the 2nd has looked pretty bare. Okay. Sumy, again, the same issue, right? General staff is really truncating the amount of things that they're reporting on in some cases. And then we're also seeing Sumy ODA truncating what they're reporting on in some cases. So it leaves us with really almost nothing and the impression that not much is going on here. And that's a false impression. There is a lot going on here. First off and foremost, we had airstrikes on Serednobuta, which does not often happen. I don't think I've seen airstrikes reported on Serednobuta in a long time, as far as I'm aware. It might have to be a couple months since I've seen, like more than a couple months, maybe 6 months since I've seen something like that. I could be wrong, willing to be corrected. But in any case, one person was killed and one person was injured. They were both reported as injured. We're going to see the next day that they were reported. One man died from his injuries, unfortunately. Okay. We also saw 3 people reported as wounded by a rocket strike. It just said in Sumy district. So 3 missiles hit, 3 people injured. It didn't specify whether that was in the city itself, whether that was somewhere out within Sumy Rayon, Sumy Hromada. I'm assuming Sumy Rayon because of Sumy district, so I'm not assuming the city itself. I could be wrong about that, but again, this is what I'm saying with the degradation and the quality of information that we're getting in order to come up with an accurate representation of what's happening. We really need those sources to report as much as they can with operational security in mind, but also to make sure that we can document the war as accurately as possible so that people understand the true nature of what's going on here. Okay. Take a look at Kharkiv. They did the same thing. Kharkiv Oblast has gone the way of not Chernihiv, but Sumy. and in that everything is truncated. So you might notice a lot fewer markers along the front lines in Kharkiv Oblast going forward, as Oles Syniehubov, the governor there, was really thorough with his reporting. He would give time, place, and platform, casualties, number of buildings and infrastructure, cars, vehicles destroyed, damaged, whatever it might be. He would give all that information. It was really, really great because we could accurately map a lot of the events that he was reporting. Going the way of Sumy doesn't really give us that information. So hopefully that changes going forward and we start getting more information about what's going on. But he does report on, like, for example, drone strikes across Kharkiv itself. That was widely reported on. So in the Shahed strikes across Kharkiv, we saw 46 people wounded in total. We saw also in Mykolaiv and Kupiansk, all the way down here. In Mykolaiv and Kupiansk, there was one person wounded in a Shahed strike. We also saw in Kupiansk some shelling down here, some airstrikes. Airstrikes targeted the fire station here. There was one firefighter in the building when it happened, but he was okay. He wasn't wounded either. He was completely okay. But we did see airstrikes and shelling throughout the city and the general area, which in total ended up killing one civilian and wounding another civilian. Additionally, in Veliki Burluk, we saw Shahed strikes. Shahed strikes wounded 2 people. And we also saw in Sepivka, there was 1 person wounded in an airstrike. Okay, Donetsk Oblast. Let's go here to southern Donetsk Oblast this time. So in Novohatska, right where we are right now, Novohatska down at the bottom, 3 people were killed and 1 person was wounded in airstrike. In Pokrovsk, 2 people were wounded from a combination of airstrikes and artillery shelling. In Klinove, 1 person was killed by an airstrike. In Hrishine, 2 people were wounded by shelling. In Konstantinivka, 2 people were wounded by a combination of airstrikes and shelling. And in Raiska, 1 person was wounded by shelling. So a pretty horrific day for Donetsk Oblast in terms of the reported civilian casualties. Obviously, keeping in mind they're probably higher, but noteworthy nonetheless. Dnipropetrovsk, let's talk about it. Most of our events for Dnipropetrovsk really occurred down near Nikopol for the day. Near Marhanets, we saw artillery shelling in the city there. That wounded 4 people. It was a 42-year-old grandmother, her 25 and 24-year-old, I think either daughter or son, and their spouse, their 25 or 24-year-old spouse, the 2 parents, and then a 2-year-old child was wounded in the artillery shelling. So not great. Pretty horrific there as well. Russia continuing to shell children. And in Nikopol, we saw children also wounded when so the kids, I guess this is the story here. I got to kind of like tell a little bit of the story. 2 people were wounded when there was an explosion of an unknown object in a village in Nikopol Rayon. 2 girls found some metal construction on the bank of the Shalokokoko Reservoir. The 57-year-old father of the girls sustained a severe hand injury, and the younger daughter was also injured. Both victims were hospitalized. So we know this was, from my understanding, a piece of an FPV drone that the children brought home, and then the father, tried to look at it, tinker with it, and exploded in his hands. And the 22-year-old daughter was also wounded. Okay, Kherson. Casualty report for the 2nd of May. 2 people were killed across Kherson Oblast. 9 people were wounded. In Stanislav, we saw 1 person killed from a drone strike. In Centralny, the center of Kherson, and you can see, right, look at this FPV activity compared to what we usually see. We usually have seen Antonivka and Kendika over here, and Dnipropetrovsk rayon completely flooded with drone markers. But right now, they're focusing on central part of Kherson. In the central district, 8 people were wounded from drone strikes. In Bilizerka, 1 person was wounded from artillery shelling. And then up to the north, we saw in Sablukivka. Yes, here we are. In Sablukivka, now it was a similar situation to what happened in Nikopol. A man was, in this case, he was actually attacked by the drone first. Then he picked up the drone after it didn't detonate, and then it detonated and it wounded him, but then he ended up dying from his wounds later on. So, pretty tragic incident there in Sablukivka. Some things to keep in mind regarding Mykolaiv Oblast. In Pervomaiska, we got this report of an unknown UAV. It didn't really say with which kind of strike UAV was hitting Pervomaiska, but a pretty deep drone strike there. If it's not a Shahed, then that's pretty deep. If it's a Shahed, then it's whatever. It's a Shahed. Luckily, it didn't kill or wound anybody. And Russian war crimes from 2022 in Snihorivka, we saw 2 soldiers from the 1st Motor Rifle Company of the 1st Motor Rifle Battalion. So the Pervaya Motostratskaya Rota, Motostratskaya Rota Pershego Motostratskoho Battaliona of the 205th Brigade. Yeah, I won't talk Russian anymore. I haven't taken Russian in five years, so 6 years. So give me a break. But yeah, 205th Motorized Rifle Brigade. I speak Ukrainian better than I speak Russian now. So these guys, 205th Brigade, they are the war crimes brigade that we know from drone strikes on Beryaslav. So these guys are now kind of in this area, carrying out drone strikes throughout this area, like from Zmivka all the way down. And actually, I think even in Chervony Mayak, they might be further up as well. But 205th is interesting. So they were one of the brigades that crossed and helped take Kherson in the initial 2022 full-scale invasion. They were part of this like thrust that went up through Snihorivka, Berezhnihvata, yeah, and then to Bashtanka, like up in this area. And I think they were trying to even get to like Voznesensk at one point to try and cut off Mykolaiv. But they were beaten back pretty severely at one point. I don't remember along which road where it was specifically, but I know the 205th were absolutely mauled trying to take Mykolaiv. And on their way out, they were stationed, like once things kind of settled in and around Mykolaiv in March and April, they were in and around this area here, and eventually I think they were pushed out and settled up near Beryaslav. So just an interesting side note. I've been following those guys for a while. And that's also where that guy Osvidomital Alex, the war crimes blogger, that likes to post the drone strikes on civilians in Kherson, that's his brigade. He used to serve in that unit. All right, 3rd of May. 3rd of May, let's start in Zakarpattia. In Zakarpattia, we saw a grenade. So I can't show the picture because it's pretty bad. But it was during, I guess these guys were drinking. There's 2 dudes hanging out. One guy was playing with a grenade and he accidentally pulled the pin and it blew up. It killed him and wounded his friend. So a lot of grenades this week, unfortunately. In Rivne, pretty crazy incident. I'm not going to show the picture as well because it, by some standards, could be graphic. 2 14-year-old boys jumped in and saved a drowning woman from a river in Rivne, which was pretty crazy. Just another note on drowning. We also saw in Chernihiv on the 2nd and in Ivano-Frankivsk on the 3rd, 2 drowning incidences with children, a 10-year-old and a 13-year-old, both drowned and died, unfortunately, on 3rd and 2nd in southwestern Ukraine. In Kyiv, Shahed strikes, nothing crazy. No casualties. Now we get OK Pivnich, and you can see the scale of drone strikes going on the Chernihiv border. The human safari is in full swing on the Chernihiv border. I am confident of that. We saw a focus on Mkhi, which means moss, I think, as far as I know, as far as I'm aware. Mkhi means moss. So Mkhi had a lot of attention in addition to drone strikes across the entire border. We also saw Shostka come under Shahed strikes. We saw, again, airstrikes up near Seredna Buda, near Chernatska here, and Khlibrov over here on the border. So heating up in Seredna Buda, as far as we know. And I added OK Pivnich into the mix, and look what happened. A whole bunch of shelling that wasn't there the day before is there now. So we have a much better idea of what's going on here thanks to OK Pivnich. Again, drone strikes pretty much all along that border there. Same with down here. Thank OK Pivnich for that as well. Elsewhere in Sumy, doggos, more doggos, and chickens. Actually, I think 30 chickens. Yeah, 30 chickens. But yeah, she had 2 Pekingese, I think those are, and then some. I'm not great with dog breeds, but some other dog. But yeah, an old woman and her doggos and her chickens got evacuated to safety, so they are safe. That's good. But it was good to see the dogs, and you can tell the police officer's happy to see the dogs too. That guy's loving it. Okay. Moving on. Kharkiv. Shahed strikes. Again, you can see the reduction in the amount of information in terms of shelling that we're getting. We do have a little bit coming from OK Pivnich over here because their like line of command or area of control, area of operation, I should say, extends into this part of Kharkiv, into Bohudukiv. And I think the rest is part of the Eastern Command. So we did see drone strikes and shelling in Klinova Novoselivka, which used to be called Oleksandrivka, but it's now Klinova Novoselivka, and Lemishina. All right. In addition, we saw in Veliki Burluk a Shahed strike, which wounded 2 people. And then we saw an airstrike in Borova, which killed 1 person. In Donetsk Oblast, we saw Komar. There were 2 people killed in Komar from a combination of airstrikes and shelling. In Mirnohrad, there was 1 person killed from artillery shelling. In Konstantinivka, there was one person wounded from, we're not sure, but it could have been anything because Konstantinivka on that day also got hit by, was hit by artillery airstrikes, drone strikes, and MRL shelling of various kinds. So, kind of hard to definitively say exactly what was the cause of the civilian casualty in Konstantinivka. In Urayska, one person was wounded from artillery shelling. Okay, Dnipro. Let's talk about Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. In Dnipro, there were Shahed strikes. Per usual, that's pretty much an everyday affair, or every night affair, almost every night. In Novopavlivka, we saw a lot of drone and airstrikes on Novopavlivka. 2 police officers were wounded in an FPV drone strike there. We also saw people evacuated. Now, one of the stories that I've seen is people were evacuated from this area, Novopavlivka, Mazhova, Velika Mykolaivka, after they were living originally in Novorodivka. So they moved from Novorodivka during the fall and went to Novopavlivka. Now, Novopavlivka is being smashed by airstrikes and drone strikes every single day. So they are now going to Dnipro. So they're going to resettle in Dnipro. But it kind of shows you what people have to go through. Yeah. In addition, we also saw Shahed strikes in Cherkasy. And in Zaporizhzhia, kind of an odd incident here. But I think interesting for some reasons. Now, I won't show... I can show this. Yeah, I can show that. So, what we saw here is there was a guy who was walking around Zaporizhzhia in a German World War II uniform, which not allowed, especially with the things that he had on it. Certain things, certain symbols of certain groups are not allowed in Ukraine and are criminally punishable. So he was arrested. This guy had a grenade on him, and so they went back to his house, and wouldn't you know, this guy's got one hell of a stash. From what I can tell, he's got a couple 2-tree grenades here. He's got some Vogs of various kinds. He's got some sort of anti-personnel mine. I think it might be like a Mon 50. This green block kind of looks like it's like a Russian version of a Claymore mine, basically. This is a grenade launcher here for the Vogs. So this is an underbarrel grenade launcher, or I guess in this case you could use it dismounted to launch grenades. But yeah, that's interesting. And I think that's an RPK. I could be wrong. It might be an RPD. I can't tell because of the mag, and also I'm not a firearms expert. So I think it's an RPK because of the extendo mags here that we got. So could be wrong. Okay. Moving on in Kherson. Also, we did see significant amount of strikes, but actually no casualties. MRL, drones, artillery, all across the southern part of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, heading into Kherson. In Kherson Oblast, across the whole oblast, there were 5 casualties reported. 1 person killed, 4 people wounded, mostly in Centralny, in the central district. Again, that's where we're seeing most of our activity. They've actually really been focusing in and around Independence Square here and along Independence Avenue, which is this main thoroughfare down the middle of the central district here. That's really sort of the main square here. So we've been seeing drone attacks there. We have geolocated evidence there. Interestingly, I think on Google Maps you can actually see the vehicle. It's a yellow truck that I think loads into this department store here regularly. It transports goods and unloads there regularly. You can see it on Google Maps, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, Zome and I were talking about that the other day. But yeah, there's been a lot of strikes focusing around the central department store, Independence Square. Some other areas that get hit here is like this area here has a lot of activity. Slavy Park has a lot of activity. Sometimes the Palace of Youth and Students right here has a lot of activity. Depends. And we have actually been seeing like not as much activity with inside Kherson's Dnipropetrovsk district itself, but kind of up the alley here, on Zalaherser Ulica. It's a Hungarian name, I think, because I looked up where it was and it sent me to Hungary one time because there's a town named Zalegerseg or something, or Zalegerseg, but Zalahersa in Ukrainian. Okay. Random factoid. You don't need to know that. 2 people wounded in Antonivka from shelling. In Beryaslav, up the river, we saw 3 people, 3 police officers, I should say, wounded in a drone attack on the city. Elsewhere, we saw in Mykolaiivka, or Mykolaiv Oblast, not Mykolaivka. In Mykolaiv Oblast, we saw in near Halitsinove, a drone strike, a pretty deep FPV or maybe a fixed wing like a Molnia or something like that. Drone strike reported here, but they said FPV, so could be a Molnia because technically those are FPV technically. So, all right, and again, Kutsurub. Bashtanka, Shahed, unknown strike UAV near Voznesenska. We don't know what it is, but that is the 3rd. All right, and the last day here, the 4th of May. Let's talk about Kyiv. On the 4th of May, we saw overnight drone strikes across the city, focusing mostly on Sviatoshinsky and Oblonsky and Shevchenkivsky, as well as the park here, also caught on fire from Shahed strikes in the hydro park, or hydro park, to say it correctly. So what we saw there were 11 civilian casualties across the entire city from those Shahed strikes and the resulting fires and the debris falling from the sky after interceptions. So pretty significant amount of Shahed drones on Kyiv. In Chernihiv, again, we can see how Pivnich has really given us a much better idea of what's going on here, really helping us flush out the situation. In Sumy, again, Pivnich really helping us understand what's going on here. Like, we would never have gotten this idea, or not this idea, but this report of a Molnia drone, right, being used in Sumy from the other places. So, really nice to see Pivnich doing that for us. Again, airstrikes and drone strikes and artillery, focusing on Seredna Buda there, and focusing on Esmanska, Novoslobodka, I should say. In Bilopilia, we had a pretty significant strike with MRL, which wounded 2 civilians. Then to the south, in Velika Pisarivka, we saw a airstrike, which killed 1 civilian there as well. Okay. In Kharkiv, unfortunately, like I said, they had gone the way of Sumy ODA, so we really are losing a lot of information. But in Zolochiv, We know there was an airstrike somewhere in Zolochivska Hromada, or in Zolochiv itself. In that strike, 4 people were wounded. Additionally, there was also an airstrike in Serkuni. 3 people were wounded. And then in Kupiansk, there was a lot of activity in Kupiansk. Across Kupiansk, we saw 3 people wounded from airstrikes, 1 person wounded from MRL strikes, and 2 people wounded from other kinds of artillery and shelling. In Donetsk, we saw 5 people wounded in Pokrovsk, 3 people wounded in Drushkivka, and 2 people wounded in Zorichne. Most of that is from airstrikes, specifically Pokrovsk and Drushkivka, those mass casualty events there. Drushkivka here. Airstrikes. And Pokrovsk. We've been seeing a lot of airstrike activity in the Shakhtarsky district, down here in the southern district. Okay. Zaporizhzhia. We saw airstrikes on Chernihiv, wounding 2 people. And then a casualty update from 1st of May. 34 total victims, 16 still in the hospital. 2 are still in pretty severe condition, rough shape. Okay, in Dnipropetrovsk, in Marhanets, we saw, again, we had that mass casualty event where it was 9 workers 9 workers killed, and I think it reached 54 total wounded, which happened right around here. We're still getting drone strikes throughout Marhanets and the coastal villages here, all the way into Marivska Hromada, and between Marivska and Marhanetska Hromadas. We're getting lots of activity there as well. That resulted in 3 civilian casualties. And in Novopavlivka, we saw airstrikes result in 1 civilian casualty. They were killed. 1 civilian killed, sorry. Not just a casualty. It was a civilian fatality. Also, Shaheds in Cherkasy. But Cherkasy didn't really report how many people were wounded. They just said several. So I don't really know how many people were wounded in these Shahed strikes across Cherkasy in the city. It would be good to know for documentation purposes, but the reporting isn't always super clear. In Kherson, our casualty report, there were 7 wounded across Kherson Oblast. Mostly that was occurring within the central district. Again, if we zoom in, Independence Square and the department store and other areas throughout the central district. We saw 5 people wounded. 4 of them were utility workers. So we think back to that viral video. I think it was maybe mid-March or maybe the end of March. I can't really remember exactly when the video went viral. But it was a strike that occurred in October that wounded 5 people. And literally the day before that, there was another strike which wounded another 5 people. All of them utility workers in Kherson. So this is a pattern where utility workers have been specifically targeted by FPV drones or by skid drop attacks from Mavics while they're carrying out repairs on roofs, windows, electrical grid. Like I've seen it all. I've seen reports of it all, videos of it all. We have videos reaching back into the early summer of strikes on repair workers, on these utility workers. So it is part of a tactic. Okay. And one person was wounded in Hulets and another in Karabalny by drones as well. Okay. That does it. That is everything for the news this week. Thank you guys for listening. Again, please feel free to send a little bit of a donation either on YouTube or to Andrew's Buy Me a Coffee through his link on either YouTube or on X. And we can use that towards identifying more vehicles with more satellite footage if we can still buy it. And please check out my reporting. I'll try to report on Kherson as I can. This is really taking up a huge amount of my time. I didn't say it in the last video, but I mean, we're getting, in some cases, we're getting over 600 news markers per day, and it's just me. So it's a lot sometimes, and I do feel like I'm going insane sometimes, but I'm here making this video pretty regularly. Hopefully we can do this. You guys can try and see if I can get a Kherson Weekly out every now and again to kind of keep reporting on the situation in Kherson beyond what I talk about here, because I do like to talk about it in more depth because it is really, really important to me personally. So you guys can check that out at Kelly2276 on X. And that's all I got for you guys. Slava Ukraini, Horaim Slava.